Crimson Western Courage. Magnolia Maggie Boone had spent years enforcing the law, not breaking it. But when Colt Rollins, the man she once loved and lost, was dragged into her jail cell, she felt everything she built start to shake. He smirked from behind the bars, his voice rough as gravel. "Didn't think you'd see me again, Sheriff," he murmured. "Bet you thought about me more than you care to admit." Chapter 1. The Badge and the Burden. The weight of the badge felt heavier than usual, a cold, metallic press against Magnolia Maggie Boone's chest. It had been her shield, her identity, for 15 years, ever since she'd pinned it on, a young woman determined to carve a place for herself in the unforgiving landscape of Redemption, Arizona territory. A place that, until that very moment, hadn't included the ghost of Colt Rollins. The air in the small, stone jailhouse was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and regret, a combination Maggie knew all too well. The single oil lamp hanging from the ceiling cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the two occupants herself and the man staring back at her from behind the iron bars. He hadn't changed much, not in the ways that mattered. The same lean, hard build, honed by years of living on the edge of the law, or perhaps just beyond it. The same eyes, the color of a stormy sky just before the lightning cracks, held her gaze with an unsettling intensity. His dark hair was a little longer, brushing the collar of a worn, dusty coat, and there were new lines etched around his mouth, a testament to the harshness of the life he'd chosen. Or the life that had chosen him. That was always the question with Colt. "Didn't think you'd see me again, Sheriff," he murmured, his voice rough as gravel, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine, a shiver she fiercely tried to ignore. The title, Sheriff, felt like a barrier between them, a wall she'd painstakingly built, brick by agonizing brick. "Bet you thought about me more than you care to admit." The smirk that played on his lips was a familiar weapon, one he'd used to disarm her years ago, when she was still Maggie, the girl with dreams bigger than the vast, open sky above Redemption. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral. "You were a fool to come back, Colt." It was a statement, not a question, her voice devoid of the tremor she felt inside. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, a bitter reminder of the choices they'd both made. Choices that had led them to this moment, on opposite sides of the law, and of something far more profound. "Foolishness is a luxury I can't always afford, Maggie." He shifted, the chains on his wrists clinking softly, a stark counterpoint to the silence that stretched between them. "Besides," he added, his voice dropping to a low, intimate drawl, "some things are worth the risk." Maggie's hand instinctively went to the worn, wooden handle of her Colt peacemaker, a familiar comfort in a world of uncertainties. The gesture wasn't lost on him. His eyes flickered down to the gun, then back up to her face, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps a challenge, in their depths. "Don't be stupid, Colt. There's nothing here for you but trouble." She hated the slight waver in her voice, the betraying hint of vulnerability that she'd spent years burying. He leaned closer to the bars, his voice a near whisper, meant for her ears alone. "Maybe trouble's what I'm looking for." The jailhouse was part of a larger building that also housed Maggie's small office and a single, sparsely furnished room where she slept. It was a far cry from the sprawling Boone ranch she'd grown up on, the ranch she'd left behind, along with a part of her heart, when she'd chosen this life. The memories of those days, of sun-drenched fields and the scent of horses and hay, seemed a lifetime away, faded and distant like an old photograph. Her father, a man as weathered and unyielding as the land he'd tamed, had never understood her decision. He'd wanted her to marry well, to settle down, to continue the Boone legacy. He hadn't understood the fire in her belly, the need to prove herself, to be more than just a rancher's daughter. He certainly hadn't understood her feelings for Colt Rollins, the son of a neighboring rancher, a boy with a wild streak and a reputation for trouble. A boy who had stolen her heart and then ridden away, leaving her with nothing but shattered dreams and a burning resolve to never be that vulnerable again. The silence returned, punctuated only by the crackling of the oil lamp and the distant howl of a coyote. Maggie took a deep breath, trying to regain control of her emotions. She needed to be strong, to be the sheriff, not the girl he remembered. You're charged with rustling, Colt. Stealing cattle from the Henderson spread. They have witnesses. She recited the charges mechanically, the words a shield against the turmoil inside her. He shrugged, a careless gesture that belied the seriousness of the situation. Witnesses can be wrong. These witnesses aren't. And Henderson's a powerful man. He wants you to hang. Colt's eyes narrowed slightly. He always did have a flair for the dramatic. Maggie knew Henderson. He was a ruthless, ambitious man who had built his empire on the backs of others, and he wouldn't hesitate to make an example of Colt. It was the way of things in this harsh land. Justice was often swift and brutal, and sentiment had no place in it. I can't help you, Colt, she said, the words heavy with a truth she couldn't escape. Not this time. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching, probing. I'm not asking for your help, Maggie, he said finally, his voice low and steady. I'm just asking you to remember. Remember. The word hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of years and regrets. Remember the stolen kisses under a starlit sky, the whispered promises, the dreams they'd shared. Remember the day he'd ridden away, without a word, leaving her standing in the dust, her heart breaking. Remember the pain, the betrayal, the slow, agonizing process of rebuilding her life, of becoming someone else, someone stronger, someone who wouldn't be hurt again. But as she looked at him now, at the man he had become, she realized that some wounds never fully heal. Some memories, like embers buried deep beneath the ashes, still held the power to burn. And the sight of Colt Rollins, behind bars, in her jail, was stirring those embers back to life. The question was, would they ignite a fire that would consume them both, or could they somehow forge a new path, a path that led away from the shadows of the past and towards a future she hadn't dared to imagine? She looked down at her hands, at the calluses and the faint scars, reminders of the battles fought and the price of survival. She needed to know why he was back, what game he was playing at, and if it had anything to do with the past they both knew better than to revisit. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past Return. The silence that followed Colt's plea remember was heavier than the iron bars separating them. Maggie turned away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. She walked to the small, dusty window at the back of the jail cell, staring out at the fading light painting the distant mesas in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of the landscape, usually a source of solace, offered no comfort tonight. It only served to amplify the turmoil within her. Remembering won't change anything, Colt, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her back still to him. It won't change the charges, it won't change Henderson's thirst for blood, and it certainly won't change what happened between us. She heard him move, the scrape of his boots against the stone floor, the jangle of his chains. He was close now, close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, even through the bars. Maybe not, he conceded, his voice low and rough, but it might help you understand why I'm here. She closed her eyes, fighting back the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Understanding. That was what she craved, what she'd craved for 15 long years. Understanding why he'd left, why he'd shattered their dreams, why he'd chosen a path that led him so far away from her. But understanding came at a price she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. There's nothing to understand, she said, her voice tight with forced composure. You made your choices, I made mine. We're on different sides now. Are we, Maggie? He reached out, his fingers brushing against the bars, close enough that she could have touched them if she dared. Are we really so different? She flinched, pulling back from the almost contact, the phantom warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. Don't, she said, her voice sharper this time. Don't play games with me, Colt. I'm not that naive girl anymore. He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. No, you're not. You're the sheriff. Hardened, they say. Unforgiving. He paused, his voice softening slightly. But I see something else in your eyes, Maggie. Something that hasn't changed. She finally turned to face him, her expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference. "And what's that?" "The fire," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. "The same fire that used to burn so bright. It's still there, Maggie, buried deep, but it's there." His words struck a chord, a raw, vulnerable place within her that she'd tried so hard to protect. She hated him for seeing it, for reminding her of the girl she used to be, the girl who had believed in love, in forever in him. "You're seeing things that aren't there, Colt," she said, her voice betraying a hint of desperation. "Am I?" He leaned closer, his voice a near whisper. "Or are you just afraid to admit it?" She took a step back, needing to put some distance between them, between his words and the truth they threatened to expose. "I'm not afraid of anything," she lied, the words ringing hollow even to her own ears. "Not even of yourself, Maggie?" The question hung in the air, a challenge, an invitation, a threat. She looked at him, at the man who had once held her heart in his hands, and saw not just the outlaw, the accused rustler, but the boy she had loved, the boy who had known her better than anyone else. And in that moment, she realized that she was afraid. Afraid of the feelings he still stirred within her, afraid of the past, afraid of the future, and most of all, afraid of the truth that lay buried beneath the layers of anger and resentment. The sound of a horse approaching broke the tension, the rhythmic beat of hooves against the hard-packed earth drawing closer. Maggie turned towards the front of the jailhouse, her hand instinctively going to her gun. It was probably just Jed, her deputy, returning from his patrol. But in this land, you could never be too careful. "Stay here," she said to Colt, her voice firm, the sheriff in her taking charge again. "Don't try anything foolish." He gave her a slow, knowing smile. "Wouldn't dream of it, Sheriff." Maggie stepped out of the jail cell, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind her, the clang of the lock echoing in the small space. She walked through her office, a sparsely furnished room with a desk, a few chairs, and a gun rack on the wall. The walls were adorned with wanted posters, a stark reminder of the lawlessness that she was sworn to combat. As she reached the front door, she saw Jed dismounting outside, his weathered face creased with concern. Jed was a good man, loyal and dependable, a steady presence in her often chaotic life. He'd been her father's foreman before she'd taken over as sheriff, and he'd stayed on, offering her his quiet support and unwavering loyalty. "Trouble, Maggie?" he asked, his voice tinged with the familiar drawl of the West. "Maybe," she said, her gaze flickering back towards the jail cell. "We have a visitor." Jed followed her gaze, his eyes widening slightly as he saw Colt through the bars. "Colt Rollins," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Well, I'll be." "He's been charged with rustling," Maggie explained, her voice brisk and businesslike. "Henderson's cattle." Jed whistled low. "That's a heap of trouble. Henderson will be wanting his pound of flesh." "I know," Maggie said, her jaw tightening. "But he'll have to go through me first." Jed looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You be careful, Maggie," he said, his voice earnest. "Colt Rollins is a dangerous man." "I can handle him," she said, her voice filled with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. But as she looked back at the jail cell, at the shadowy figure of the man who had once held her heart, she knew that handling Colt Rollins might be the hardest thing she'd ever done. And a part of her, the part she tried so hard to ignore, was terrified and thrilled by the prospect, all at once. She was a changed woman, but the landscape and Colt remembered the girl. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in steel. The night deepened, casting long, inky shadows across the jailhouse. Maggie sat at her desk, the flickering lamplight illuminating the paperwork spread before her the formal charges against Colt Rollins, Henderson's sworn affidavit, and the hastily scribbled statements of the two ranch hands who claimed to have witnessed the rustling. It all seemed so clear-cut, so damning, yet a knot of unease remained twisted in her stomach. Jed had left, promising to return at first light with a fresh horse for Maggie and to keep an eye on things around town. Redemption was a small, isolated community, And news traveled fast, especially bad news. The arrest of Colt Rollins would be the talk of the town by morning, and Maggie knew she needed to be prepared for the fallout. She glanced towards the jail cell, where Colt remained silent and watchful. He hadn't said a word since Jed's departure, but she could feel his gaze on her, a constant, unsettling presence. She tried to focus on the paperwork, but her mind kept drifting back to their conversation, to his words, to the unsettling way he seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses. Finally, she pushed the papers aside, unable to concentrate any longer. She stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the quiet room. She walked towards the jail cell, her steps slow and deliberate. Colt watched her approach, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was leaning against the bars, his arms crossed, his posture relaxed, yet there was a coiled tension in him, a sense of readiness that sent a shiver down her spine. "You going to stare at me all night, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm trying to figure you out, Colt," she said, stopping a few feet from the bars. "Trying to understand why you're really here." He gave a slight shrug. "I told you. I was accused of a crime I didn't commit. And I'm supposed to believe that?" Maggie scoffed, her voice laced with skepticism. "You have a reputation, Colt. A reputation for bending the law, for taking what you want, for not caring who gets hurt in the process. Reputations are often built on lies and half-truths. Maggie," he said, his voice even. "You should know that better than anyone." His words hit their mark. She did know it. She'd seen firsthand how rumors and whispers could twist the truth, how easily a person's character could be tarnished, how quickly a community could turn on someone. She'd experienced it herself, after Colt had left, after the whispers had started about her, about the heartbroken girl who'd been foolish enough to fall for an outlaw. "Maybe," she conceded, her voice softer now. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're here, in my jail, facing serious charges." "So, what are you going to do, Maggie?" he asked, his gaze holding hers. "Are you going to let Henderson string me up? Are you going to stand by and watch while another innocent man hangs?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Was he truly innocent? Or was he playing her, using her past feelings for him to manipulate her? She didn't know, and the uncertainty was eating at her. "I'm going to uphold the law, Colt," she said, her voice firm, despite the turmoil inside her. "That's my job." "The law isn't always just, Maggie," he said, his voice low and intense. "You know that. You've seen it yourself." He was right. She had seen it. She'd seen how the law could be bent and twisted to serve the powerful, how the weak and vulnerable often suffered, how justice could be a commodity bought and sold. It was one of the reasons she'd become sheriff, to try and make a difference, to try and ensure that the law was applied fairly, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "What do you want from me, Colt?" she asked, her voice weary. He took a step closer, his fingers wrapping around the bars. "I want you to listen to me, Maggie," he said, his voice a near whisper. "I want you to hear my side of the story. And then I want you to help me. Help him." The words echoed in her mind. Help the man who had broken her heart, the man who was now accused of a serious crime, the man who could very well be playing her for a fool. It was a dangerous proposition, a risk that could cost her everything, her reputation, her job, perhaps even her life. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of desperation, a hint of vulnerability that she couldn't ignore. And there was the nagging voice of her own conscience, the voice that told her she couldn't simply stand by and watch him hang without at least hearing him out. "I'll listen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that's all I'm promising." A flicker of something that might have been relief crossed his face. "That's all I ask." He began to tell his story, his voice low and steady, the words painting a picture of a world far more complex than the black and white of the charges against him. He spoke of a long-standing feud between the Hendersons and the Rollinses, a feud that had its roots in a land dispute generations ago. He spoke of Henderson's ruthless ambition, his willingness to use any means necessary to expand his empire, his history of framing those who stood in his way. He claimed that the rustling charges were a fabrication, a way for Henderson to finally get rid of him, to eliminate the last obstacle to his complete control of the valley. He said that the witnesses had been bribed, that the evidence had been planted, that he had been framed. Maggie listened intently, her mind racing, trying to separate the truth from the lies, the facts from the fiction. It was a tangled web, a story of betrayal, greed, and long-held grudges, a story that resonated with the harsh realities of the frontier. As he spoke, she began to see glimpses of the boy she had once known, the boy with a rebellious spirit and a strong sense of justice, the boy who had always stood up for the underdog. Could he have changed so much? Could he have become the ruthless outlaw that Henderson claimed he was? "There's a ledger," Colt said, interrupting her thoughts. "Henderson keeps a ledger, detailing all his illegal dealings, his bribes, his payoffs, his everything. It's proof of his corruption, proof of my innocence." "And where is this ledger?" Maggie asked, her voice skeptical. "It's hidden," he said. "Hidden in a place that only I know. I can get it, Maggie. I can prove my innocence, and I can expose Henderson for what he is. But I need your help." "My help?" Maggie repeated, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you expect me to do?" "I need you to let me go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to trust me." Trust him. The words echoed in her mind, a dangerous, intoxicating proposition. Trust the man who had betrayed her once before. Trust the man who is now asking her to risk everything, to break the law she had sworn to uphold, to potentially throw away her life for his. It was madness. It was impossible. And yet she looked at him, at the desperation in his eyes, at the raw vulnerability that he couldn't quite hide, and she knew that she couldn't simply turn away. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he might be telling the truth, that he might be innocent, that he might be the only one who could expose Henderson's corruption and bring justice to this land. "If I do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "if I let you go, and you're lying to me, Colt, I'll hunt you down myself. And I'll see you hang." A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Sheriff," he said. The bargain was struck, a pact forged in the shadows of the jailhouse, sealed with a look, a promise, and the weight of a shared past. Maggie knew she was taking a gamble, a desperate, reckless gamble, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was a gamble she had to take. She was risking everything, her career, her reputation, her very life, but she was also risking something far more precious, her heart. And as she made the decision that would change their lives forever, she wondered if she was being a fool, or if she was finally, after all these years, starting to remember what it truly meant to be alive. Chapter 4. Whispers on the Wind. The decision hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable, like the calm before a storm. Maggie retrieved the key to Colt's cell from the ring on her belt, her hand trembling slightly. The metal felt cold and weighty, a symbol of the responsibility she was about to shirk, the oath she was about to break. She looked at Colt, his eyes dark and intense in the flickering lamplight. "Don't make me regret this," she said, her voice low and firm. "You won't," he replied, his voice equally low, a promise laced with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher, gratitude, perhaps, or something more. The lock clicked open with a resounding snap, the sound echoing in the silent jailhouse. Maggie pushed the heavy cell door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Colt stepped out, free from the confines of the iron bars, but still bound by the invisible chains of their agreement, their shared past, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. He stood before her, tall and imposing, his presence filling the small space. He was close, too close, and Maggie could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of leather and dust that clung to him, a scent that stirred long-dormant memories. "We need to move fast," she said, her voice brisk, trying to regain her composure, to push back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Henderson will be expecting me to transport you to the county seat in the morning. We need to be gone before dawn." "I have a horse stashed a few miles outside of town," Colt said. "In a canyon to the west. It's well hidden, but we should still be careful." Maggie nodded. "I'll get my gear." Meet me behind the jailhouse in 10 minutes. She turned and walked back to her office, her mind racing. She needed to gather her supplies, her rifle, her ammunition, her bedroll, enough provisions to last them for a few days. She also needed to leave a note for Jed, something that would explain her absence without revealing the truth. Something that would buy them some time. She scribbled a hasty note, saying that she was taking Colt to a more secure holding cell in a neighboring town, a precaution against a possible breakout attempt by his associates. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was the best she could come up with on short notice. She left the note on her desk, weighed down with a heavy paperweight. She gathered her belongings, her movements quick and efficient, years of experience, making her actions almost automatic. As she strapped on her gun belt, she caught her reflection in the small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. She looked older, harder, than the girl who had once dreamed of a life with Colt Rollins. But there was also a flicker of something else in her eyes, a spark of excitement, of defiance, of something that felt dangerously close to hope. She extinguished the lamp in her office, plunging the room into darkness. She made her way to the back door of the jailhouse, her boots silent on the wooden floor. She stepped outside, into the cool night air, the vast, star-studded sky stretching above her. Colt was waiting for her, leaning against the back wall of the building, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the moon. He straightened as she approached, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Maggie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's go." They moved quickly and quietly, staying in the shadows, avoiding the main street of Redemption. The town was asleep, the only sounds the distant barking of a dog and the gentle whisper of the wind. As they walked, Maggie couldn't help but steal glances at Colt. He moved with a grace and confidence that belied his outlaw status, his senses alert, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He was a man of the wild, a man who knew how to survive, a man who was both dangerous and captivating. They reached the edge of town, the last buildings giving way to the open desert. The landscape stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, a tapestry of shadows and moonlight. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust, a scent that was both familiar and exhilarating. "The canyon is about 2 hours' ride from here," Colt said, his voice breaking the silence. "We should reach it before sunrise." They walked in silence for a while, the only sound their footsteps and the occasional rustle of a nocturnal creature. Maggie's mind was filled with a mix of apprehension and anticipation. She was breaking the law, aiding a wanted man, risking everything she had worked for. But she was also following her instincts, trusting her gut, giving Colt a chance to prove his innocence. "Why did you come back, Colt?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "After all these years, why now?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I told you. I was framed." "That's not what I meant," Maggie said. "Why come back to Redemption? Why risk facing Henderson, facing me?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maybe I had unfinished business," he said finally, his voice low and enigmatic. Unfinished business. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Was he talking about the feud with Henderson? Or was he talking about something else, something more personal, something that had to do with her? The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the echoes of broken promises, the faint scent of hope and danger. Maggie shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. She knew that the journey ahead would be long and arduous, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But as she walked beside Colt Rollins, under the vast, unforgiving sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The whispers spoke of the land, the town, but none revealed the whispers of the heart that were beginning to rise. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom. The ride to the canyon was a tense, silent affair. The vastness of the landscape, usually a source of awe for Maggie, felt oppressive, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. The moon, their only companion, cast long, eerie shadows that danced and shifted, playing tricks on the eye. Maggie's mind raced, replaying every detail of Colt's story, searching for inconsistencies, for any sign that he was deceiving her. She knew she was taking a tremendous risk, trusting a man who had a proven track record of breaking her trust. But something in his eyes, a raw honesty she couldn't quite ignore, kept her from turning back. Colt rode with an easy confidence, his body relaxed in the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He seemed to know the land intimately, navigating the treacherous terrain with an instinctual grace. He was a man of the wild, a part of this landscape, and Maggie found herself both wary and fascinated by him. As they neared the canyon, the terrain became rougher, the path winding through a maze of towering rock formations and deep ravines. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. Maggie shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "We're almost there," Colt said, his voice low, breaking the silence. He pointed towards a narrow opening in the rock face, barely visible in the dim light. "The horse is hidden in a small cave at the back of the canyon." They dismounted, leading their horses carefully through the narrow passage. The air inside the canyon was still and heavy, the silence almost deafening. The walls of the canyon rose high above them, blocking out most of the moonlight, casting the interior into deep shadow. They reached the back of the canyon, where a small cave opened up in the rock face. Colt's horse, a magnificent black stallion, was tethered inside, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. The horse whinnied softly as Colt approached, nuzzling his hand affectionately. "This is Shadow," Colt said, stroking the horse's neck. "He's fast and reliable. He'll get us where we need to go." Maggie looked at the horse, impressed by its strength and beauty. She had always loved horses, had grown up riding them, and she felt a pang of longing for the simpler days of her youth, when her biggest concern was choosing which horse to ride on the ranch. "Where are we going?" she asked, turning to Colt. "You said the ledger was hidden. Where?" Colt hesitated, his gaze flickering around the canyon, as if searching for any sign of danger. "It's at the old Rollins homestead," he said finally, his voice low. "About a day's ride from here, to the north." The Rollins homestead. The words sent a shiver down Maggie's spine. It was where Colt had grown up, where they had spent countless hours together as children, where their dreams had been born, and where their love had blossomed. It was also where everything had fallen apart, where he had left her, without a word, shattering her heart. "Why there?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Why would Henderson hide it there?" "He wouldn't," Colt said. "I hid it there. Years ago, before I left. I knew Henderson was up to no good, even back then. I started collecting evidence, keeping records of his illegal dealings. I hid it all in a secret compartment in the old house, hoping to use it against him someday." "And you never told anyone?" Maggie asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Not even me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I couldn't, Maggie," he said. "I didn't want to put you in danger. I didn't want to involve you in my mess." His words stung, a painful reminder of the past, of his lack of trust, of his decision to leave her behind. But she pushed the pain aside, focusing on the present, on the task at hand. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Let's get going. We need to reach the homestead before Henderson realizes you're gone." They mounted their horses, Colt leading the way, Maggie following close behind. They rode out of the canyon, back into the vast, moonlit landscape, the silence once again descending upon them. As they rode, Maggie couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. She, the sheriff, was now an outlaw, riding alongside the man she had once loved, the man she was now helping to escape. She was breaking the law, betraying her duty, risking everything for a chance at redemption, for both of them. The price of freedom was high, she realized, but it was a price she was willing to pay. She had lived in the shadow of the past for too long, had allowed her fear and resentment to control her life. Now, she was taking a stand, choosing to believe in something, in someone, even if it meant risking everything. The sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold. The landscape came alive, the shadows receding, the the colors intensifying. Maggie felt a surge of hope, a sense of renewal, as if the dawn was bringing with it a chance for a new beginning. But as they rode towards the old Rollins homestead, towards the secrets that lay hidden there, she knew that the journey was far from over. The past was still with them, a constant presence, a reminder of the choices they had made, the wounds they had inflicted, and the price they had yet to pay. The freedom they sought came with the cost of confronting the source of the long-standing pain. And that confrontation, Maggie knew, could be more dangerous than any outlaw or gunfight. Chapter 6. Beneath a Sky of Secrets. The sun climbed higher, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the landscape. The air grew warmer, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Maggie's body ached from the long ride, her muscles stiff and sore, but she pushed herself onward, fueled by a mix of determination and adrenaline. She watched Colt as he rode, his posture straight and alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He seemed to be in his element, at one with the land, a stark contrast to the confined, restless energy he'd exuded in the jail cell. He was a man of the wild, she realized, and she wondered if she would ever truly understand him, if she would ever be able to bridge the gap between their two worlds. They rode in silence for most of the morning, the unspoken tension between them palpable. Maggie wanted to ask him more about his past, about his reasons for leaving, about his life since then, but she held back, afraid of opening old wounds, afraid of shattering the fragile truce they had established. As they neared the Rollins homestead, the landscape began to change, becoming more familiar, more reminiscent of Maggie's own childhood. Rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and wildflowers replaced the harsh, rocky terrain of the desert. The air smelled of pine and earth, a scent that brought back a flood of memories. "We're almost there," Colt said, his voice breaking the silence. He pointed towards a distant ridge, where a cluster of weathered buildings stood silhouetted against the sky. "The homestead is just over that ridge." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't been to the Rollins homestead in 15 years, not since the day Colt had left. It was a place filled with both joy and sorrow, a place where she had experienced both the greatest happiness and the deepest heartbreak of her life. They rode on, the silence returning, the tension building. As they crested the ridge, the Rollins homestead came into full view. It was a sprawling, ramshackle affair, consisting of a main house, a barn, a corral, and a few outbuildings. The buildings were weathered and worn, the paint peeling, the wood gray and cracked, but there was a certain rustic charm to them, a sense of history and resilience. "It hasn't changed much," Maggie said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes scanning the familiar scene. "No," Colt agreed, his voice tinged with a hint of nostalgia. "Time stands still in places like this." They dismounted, leading their horses towards the main house. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle creak of the old buildings and the distant murmur of a nearby stream. Maggie felt a sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, that they were not alone. "Stay close," Colt said, his voice low, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. "I don't know who might be around." They approached the house cautiously, their senses alert, their eyes scanning the windows and doors. The front door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges, a sign that someone had been here recently. Colt pushed the door open slowly, his gun drawn, his eyes narrowed. Maggie followed close behind, her own gun in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior of the house was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay and disuse. The furniture was covered in sheets, the floors littered with debris, the walls adorned with cobwebs. It was a ghost of a house, a shell of its former self, a stark reminder of the lives that had once been lived here. "The ledger is hidden in my father's study," Colt said, his voice a low murmur. "It's at the back of the house." They moved through the house slowly, their footsteps echoing in the silent rooms. Maggie's memories flooded back, vivid and intense, as she recognized the familiar layout of the house, the furniture, the decorations. She remembered the laughter, the warmth, the sense of belonging she had felt here, the feeling that she had found a second home, a second family. They reached the study, a small, cluttered room filled with books, papers, and old furniture. The room was dark, the only light filtering in through a single, dusty window. Colt went straight to a large, wooden desk that stood against the far wall. He knelt down, running his hand along the underside of the desk, his fingers searching for something. "It's here," he said, his voice a mix of relief and excitement. "A hidden panel. Help me lift it." Maggie helped him lift the heavy panel, revealing a small, concealed compartment beneath the desk. Inside the compartment was a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with handwritten entries. Colt took the ledger, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. Maggie watched him, her heart filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. This ledger was the key to his freedom, the proof of his innocence, the weapon that could bring down Henderson. Suddenly, a noise from outside shattered the silence, the sound of horses approaching, the shouts of men. Maggie's blood ran cold. They had been found. Colt slammed the ledger shut, his eyes wide with alarm. "Henderson," he said, his voice grim. "He must have found out we were gone." They were trapped, cornered in the old Rollins homestead, surrounded by Henderson and his men, with no way out. The sky above, once a symbol of freedom, now seemed to press down on them, heavy with the weight of their secrets, their past, and the imminent danger that threatened to engulf them. The price, she realized, might be more than they had bargained for. Chapter 7. The Dance of Doubt and Desire. The shouts grew louder, closer, the sound of pounding hooves echoing in the stillness of the abandoned homestead. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of fear. She gripped her gun tighter, her knuckles white, her senses on high alert. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice low and urgent, her eyes darting to the windows, calculating their options. Colt nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He tucked the ledger inside his coat, securing it against his chest. "The back door," he said. "There's a small path that leads down to the creek. We might be able to lose them in the trees." They moved quickly, silently, their boots barely making a sound on the dusty wooden floor. They slipped through the kitchen, past the old, cast-iron stove, the faded curtains, the remnants of a life long gone. Maggie's mind raced, trying to anticipate Henderson's next move, trying to formulate a plan, a way out of this seemingly impossible situation. They reached the back door, Colt easing it open slowly, peering outside, his gun drawn. The coast seemed clear for the moment, but they knew it wouldn't last. Henderson's men were closing in, their voices growing louder, their presence a tangible threat. "Go," Colt whispered, pushing her gently towards the door. "I'll cover you." Maggie hesitated, her gaze locking with his. She saw the determination in his eyes, the unwavering resolve, but she also saw something else, something that made her heart ache, a flicker of fear, a hint of vulnerability, a reminder that he was just a man, caught in a desperate situation, fighting for his life. "We go together," she said, her voice firm, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, a brief, electric contact that sent a shiver through her. He nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Together, he agreed. They slipped outside, into the blinding sunlight, the sudden brightness making Maggie squint. They moved quickly, staying low to the ground, using the cover of the overgrown bushes and trees to conceal their movements. The shouts of Henderson's men were getting closer, their horses' hooves pounding the earth. Relentless pursuit that sent a wave of adrenaline through Maggie's veins. They reached the small path that led down to the creek, a narrow, winding trail that was barely visible amidst the dense undergrowth. They scrambled down the path, their feet slipping on the loose rocks and dirt, the sounds of their pursuers echoing behind them. They reached the creek, the cool water rushing over the smooth stones, a welcome respite from the heat and tension. They plunged into the trees on the other side, the dense foliage providing a temporary shield from their pursuers. "We need to keep moving," Colt said, his voice breathless, his eyes scanning the woods around them. They'll be searching the area. We need to find a place to hide, to regroup. They moved deeper into the woods, the trees growing taller, the shadows deepening, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Maggie's mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, a way to escape Henderson's clutches, a way to get the ledger to safety, a way to prove Colt's innocence. They found a small clearing, hidden amidst a cluster of towering pines, the sunlight filtering through the branches, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. They collapsed onto the soft earth, their bodies aching, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Colt leaned against a tree, his eyes closed, his chest heaving. Maggie sat beside him, her gun still in her hand, her senses still on high alert. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, with the shared danger, with the weight of their past. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Maggie said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence, her words tinged with despair. Colt opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto hers. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Don't say that," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We're not giving up. We'll find a way." His touch, his words, his unwavering belief in them, gave Maggie a surge of strength, a renewed sense of hope. She looked at him, at the man who had once broken her heart, the man who was now fighting alongside her, risking his life for her, and she felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her: doubt, fear, desire, and something else, something she hadn't felt in years, something that felt dangerously close to love. The dance of doubt and desire, of fear and hope, of past and present, swirled around them, a complex choreography of emotions that mirrored the tangled web of their lives. They were caught in a dangerous game, a game with no rules, a game where the stakes were higher than ever before. And as they sat there, in the hidden clearing, beneath the watchful eyes of the ancient trees, they knew that the dance was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. One wrong step, and the music might stop entirely. Chapter 8. Scars of Yesterday. The clearing felt like a fragile sanctuary, a temporary reprieve from the relentless pursuit. The dappled sunlight, the rustling leaves, the soft earth beneath them, it all seemed a world away from the danger that lurked just beyond the trees. But the illusion of peace was shattered by the distant shouts of Henderson's men, a constant reminder that their time was running out. Maggie shifted, her hand still covered by Colt's. The warmth of his touch, the steady pressure of his fingers, was both comforting and unsettling. It stirred memories, long-buried emotions, feelings she had tried so hard to suppress. "We need a plan," she said, her voice low, her gaze meeting his. "We can't stay here forever. They'll find us eventually." Colt nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. "I know," he said. "We need to get to higher ground, to a place where we can see them coming, where we have a better chance of defending ourselves." He released her hand, the absence of his touch leaving a sudden chill. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, his movements fluid and graceful, despite the exhaustion that must have been weighing him down. "There's a ridge about a mile from here," he said. "It overlooks the valley. We can see anyone approaching from miles away." Maggie stood up as well, her own muscles protesting. She holstered her gun, feeling the familiar weight of it against her hip. "All right," she said. "Let's go." They moved cautiously through the woods, staying off the main paths, using the cover of the trees to conceal their movements. The silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional distant shout of their pursuers. As they walked, Maggie couldn't help but steal glances at Colt. He moved with a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose, that both impressed and intrigued her. He was a man of action, a man of the wild, and she found herself drawn to his strength, his resilience, his unwavering determination. "Colt," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "Why didn't you ever come back?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions, with years of unanswered questions, with the lingering pain of his abandonment. He stopped, turning to face her, his expression somber, his eyes filled with regret. I wanted to, Maggie, he said, his voice low and rough. Believe me, I wanted to, but I couldn't. Why not? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, her heart aching with the old, familiar wound. What was so important that you had to leave me, to leave everything behind, without a word? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the ground. It's a long story, Maggie, he said. A complicated story. I have time, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. We have time. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decide whether to trust her, whether to reveal the secrets of his past. Finally, he nodded, a slow, reluctant gesture. After I left Redemption, he began, his voice low and hesitant, I got involved with some unsavory characters. Men who lived outside the law, men who made their living by stealing, by raiding, by killing. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that Colt had a wild streak, a rebellious spirit, but she had never imagined that he would become a true outlaw, a man living on the fringes of society, a man capable of violence. I was young, Maggie, he continued, his voice filled with self-reproach. Foolish. I thought I was invincible, that I could handle anything. I got caught up in their world, in their way of life. It was exciting, at first, the thrill of the chase, the danger, the freedom. But it was also dark and brutal, and it changed me. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the distant horizon, his eyes filled with a haunting sadness. I saw things, Maggie, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Things I can't forget. Things that still haunt me. Maggie reached out, her hand touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. She could see the pain in his eyes, the scars of yesterday etched on his soul. She knew that he was telling the truth, that he had lived a life far different from the one she had imagined, a life filled with darkness and regret. I eventually realized that I couldn't continue down that path, he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. That I had to get out, to start over, to try and make amends for the mistakes I had made. But it wasn't easy. These men, they weren't the kind to let you go. They had a hold on me, a power over me. I had to escape, to disappear, to create a new life for myself. And that's why you never came back, Maggie said, her voice soft, her heart aching for him. He nodded. I couldn't risk putting you in danger, he said. I couldn't risk them finding you, using you against me. I had to stay away to protect you. His words, his confession, his explanation, washed over Maggie, a wave of understanding, of forgiveness, of a renewed sense of connection. She had spent years hating him, resenting him, blaming him for breaking her heart. But now, she saw him in a different light, as a man who had made mistakes, who had suffered, who had been trying to protect her, in his own way. The scars weren't merely on him. They were a shared burden. I understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes filled with tears. I understand. And in some recessed part of her, a small bud of resentment began to loosen. Chapter 9. Trails of Trust and Treachery. The revelation hung between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of years and misunderstandings. The air, thick with unspoken emotions, seemed to vibrate with the weight of their shared history, their rediscovered connection, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. They continued their trek towards the ridge, the silence no longer strained, but filled with a newfound understanding, a tentative peace. Maggie walked beside Colt, her heart aching for the pain he had endured, the choices he had been forced to make, the life he had lived. She also felt a sense of relief, a lifting of the burden she had carried for so long, the burden of unanswered questions, of resentment, of a broken heart. As they reached the base of the ridge, the terrain became steeper, the climb more challenging. They scrambled up the rocky slope, their hands and feet finding purchase on the loose stones and scrub brush. The sun beat down on them, the air growing thinner, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. We're almost there, Colt said, his voice encouraging, his hand reaching out to help her over a particularly difficult stretch. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the physical attraction that still simmered between them, an attraction that had never truly died, despite the years, the pain, the betrayal. They reached the top of the ridge, the panoramic view stretching out before them, a breathtaking vista of rolling hills, sprawling valleys, and distant mountains. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of pine and earth, a wild, untamed fragrance that mirrored the spirit of this land. Colt scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed, his senses alert. "This is good," he said. "We can see anyone approaching from miles away. We have a clear line of sight in all directions." Maggie nodded, her own gaze sweeping across the landscape. She could see the Rollins homestead in the distance, a cluster of tiny buildings nestled in the valley below. She could also see a faint trail of dust rising in the distance, a telltale sign of approaching riders. "They're still coming," she said, her voice grim, her hand instinctively going to her gun. "And they're gaining on us." Colt nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes focused on the approaching dust cloud. "We need to find a defensible position," he said. "Somewhere we can make a stand." He surveyed the ridge, his eyes searching for a suitable location. He pointed towards a cluster of large boulders near the edge of the cliff, a natural fortress that offered some protection from the elements and from potential attackers. "There," he said. "That's our best bet." They moved quickly towards the boulders, their movements urgent, their senses on high alert. They took up positions behind the rocks, Colt taking the lead, Maggie covering his flank. They checked their weapons, making sure they were loaded and ready, the metallic click of the chambers a stark reminder of the imminent danger. "How many do you think there are?" Maggie asked, her voice low, her eyes scanning the approaching riders. "Hard to say," Colt replied, his voice equally low. "At least a dozen, maybe more. Henderson won't take any chances. He wants us both dead." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She had faced danger before, had been in gunfights, had stared death in the face. But this was different. This was personal. This was about more than just upholding the law. This was about protecting Colt, about proving his innocence, about fighting for their future, a future that had seemed impossible just a few days ago. As the riders drew closer, Maggie could make out their faces, their grim expressions, their determined eyes. She recognized some of them, men who worked for Henderson, men who were known for their ruthlessness, their loyalty to their boss, their willingness to kill. At the head of the group rode Henderson himself, his face a mask of anger and hatred, his eyes fixed on the ridge, on the two figures hiding behind the rocks. He was a large, imposing man, with a cruel face and a reputation for violence. He was a man who had everything, except for the one thing he wanted most: the complete and utter destruction of Colt Rollins. "They're here," Maggie said, her voice barely a whisper, her hand tightening around her gun. "Stay calm," Colt said, his voice steady, his eyes focused on Henderson. "We'll fight them together. We'll show them what we're made of." His words, his confidence, his unwavering belief in them, gave Maggie a surge of strength, a renewed sense of determination. She looked at him, at the man she had once loved, the man she was now fighting alongside, the man she was beginning to love again, and she knew that she would stand by him, no matter what. The battle lines were drawn, the stakes were high, the future uncertain. The trails of trust and treachery, of love and betrayal, of past and present, had converged on this windswept ridge, beneath the vast, unforgiving sky. And as the first shots rang out, echoing across the valley, Maggie knew that their lives would never be the same. This wasn't just a fight, it was a cleansing fire. Chapter 10. The Heart's Reckoning. The air exploded with the crack of gunfire, the sharp reports echoing across the valley, shattering the fragile peace. Bullets whizzed past Maggie's head, impacting the rocks around her, sending splinters of stone flying. She ducked lower, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. Colt returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, his movements fluid and practiced. He was a natural marksman, a man who knew how to handle a gun, a man who had been in countless gunfights before. Maggie watched him, impressed by his skill, his courage, his unwavering focus. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the din of the gunfire. "Don't expose yourself." Maggie nodded, her body pressed against the cold, hard rock, her finger tight on the trigger of her rifle. She scanned the landscape, searching for targets, for any sign of movement, for any opportunity to strike back. Henderson's men had spread out, taking cover behind rocks and trees, their fire concentrated on the two figures hiding behind the boulders. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but Maggie and Colt had the advantage of higher ground, a better defensive position, and a desperate determination to survive. Maggie spotted one of Henderson's men, a burly, bearded figure, trying to flank their position. She took aim, her fingers squeezing the trigger, the rifle bucking against her shoulder. The man cried out, clutching his arm, his gun falling to the ground. "Good shot," Colt shouted, his voice filled with admiration. Maggie felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had never killed a man before, had always tried to avoid taking a life, but she knew that she had no choice. It was kill or be killed, survive or perish. The gunfight raged on, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the cries of men, the thud of falling bodies. Maggie and Colt fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their actions complementing each other, a seamless dance of defense and attack. They were a team, bound together by a shared danger, a shared purpose, a shared past, and a growing, undeniable connection. They were fighting for their lives, for their freedom, for their future, a future that was still uncertain, still fragile, but filled with a glimmer of hope. As the battle wore on, Maggie began to feel a sense of exhaustion, her muscles aching, her head pounding, her senses dulled. She had lost track of time, of the number of shots fired, of the number of men who had fallen. All that mattered was survival, protecting Colt, staying alive. Suddenly, a sharp pain exploded in her shoulder, a searing, burning sensation that made her cry out. She stumbled, her rifle falling from her grasp, her hand instinctively going to her wound. She looked down, seeing the blood staining her shirt, the crimson spreading across her chest. "Maggie!" Colt shouted, his voice filled with alarm. He rushed to her side, his eyes wide with concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm hit," she gasped, her voice weak, her vision blurring. "My shoulder." Colt examined her wound, his touch gentle, his expression grim. "It's a graze," he said, "but it's bleeding badly. We need to stop the bleeding." He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, pressing it against her wound, applying pressure to stem the flow of blood. Maggie winced, her body trembling, her pain intense. "Hold on," Colt said, his voice soothing, his eyes filled with a tenderness she hadn't seen in years. "We'll get through this. Together." His words, his touch, his presence gave her a surge of strength, a renewed will to live. She looked at him, at the man who had once broken her heart, the man who was now risking his life to save hers, and she felt a wave of emotion wash over her: love, gratitude, forgiveness, and a profound sense of connection. The heart's reckoning had begun, a confrontation not just with the external forces arrayed against them, but with the internal wounds, the lingering doubts, the unspoken desires that had simmered between them for years. The gunfire continued, the battle raged on, but in that moment, amidst the chaos and danger, something shifted between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had never truly been broken, a bond that was now stronger, deeper, more profound than ever before. They were in this truly together, and that realization changed everything. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Canyon. Colt's makeshift bandage slowed the bleeding, but Maggie was weak, her vision blurry, her body trembling. The pain in her shoulder was a constant, throbbing reminder of her vulnerability, of the precariousness of their situation. "We need to get out of here," Colt said, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "They'll be regrouping, coming back stronger. We can't stay here." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight, his arm around her waist, a steady, reassuring presence. Maggie leaned on him, grateful for his strength, his support, his unwavering determination. "Where can we go?" she asked, her voice weak, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "There's a canyon," Colt said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distance. "A hidden canyon not far from here. It's a place I used to go as a kid, a place where no one ever goes. We can hide there, regroup, let you heal." Maggie nodded, trusting his judgment, his knowledge of the land, his instincts. She had no choice but to trust him, to rely on him, to put her life in his hands. They moved slowly, painfully, Colt supporting most of her weight, guiding her through the treacherous terrain. They left the ridge, the scene of the gunfight, the bodies of the fallen, a stark reminder of the violence, the brutality, the cost of their freedom. They made their way down the slope, staying off the main paths, using the cover of the rocks and trees to conceal their movements. The sounds of the gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the whisper of the wind. As they walked, Maggie's thoughts drifted back to the gunfight, to the moment she had been shot, to the fear, the pain, the realization that she could have died. She had faced danger before, had been in perilous situations, but this was different. This was more intense, more personal, more profound. She had been shot protecting Colt, protecting the man she loved, the man she had once lost, the man she was now rediscovering. And in that moment, she had realized that she would do anything for him, that she would risk her life for him, that her love for him was stronger than ever before. They reached the entrance to the canyon, a narrow, winding passage hidden amidst a cluster of towering rocks. Colt led her through the passage, the walls of the canyon rising high above them, blocking out most of the sunlight, casting the interior into deep shadow. The canyon was a hidden oasis, a secret world, a place of peace and tranquility. A small stream flowed through the canyon floor, its waters crystal clear, its murmur a soothing balm. Lush vegetation grew along the banks of the stream, ferns, wildflowers, and towering trees, creating a vibrant tapestry of color and life. "This is it," Colt said, his voice a soft whisper, his eyes scanning the canyon, a sense of peace settling over him. "We'll be safe here." He helped her to a small, grassy clearing near the stream, easing her down onto the soft earth. Maggie leaned against a large rock, her body exhausted, her shoulder throbbing, her mind reeling. Colt knelt beside her, his eyes filled with concern. He gently removed the makeshift bandage, examining her wound. "It's still bleeding," he said, his voice grim. "But it's not as bad as I thought. I need to clean it, bandage it properly." He gathered some water from the stream, using his bandana to cleanse her wound. Maggie winced, her body tensing, the pain sharp and intense. "I'm sorry," Colt said, his voice soothing, his touch gentle. "I know it hurts." He continued to tend to her wound, his movements careful and precise, his touch surprisingly tender. Maggie watched him, her heart filled with gratitude, with admiration, with a growing sense of love. He finished bandaging her wound, securing the cloth with a knot. He sat back, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice soft. "Tired," she said, her voice weak.
"And sore.
But I'll be all right." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, a gentle, tender gesture that sent a shiver through her. "You're strong, Maggie," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Stronger than you know." His words, his touch, his presence, filled her with a warmth, a sense of comfort, a feeling of being safe, of being loved. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her body relaxing, her heart finding a moment of peace amidst the chaos and danger. The echoes in the canyon were not just of the stream and the wind, but of their past, their present, and the uncertain future they faced together. The canyon held them in its embrace, a sanctuary where they could heal, not just their physical wounds, but the deeper scars of yesterday, the wounds that had kept them apart for so long. And as they rested there, in the hidden heart of the canyon, they knew that their journey was far from over, but that they were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. Chapter 12. When Honor Collides. The canyon provided a much-needed respite, a chance to heal, to rest, to plan their next move. Maggie's shoulder slowly began to improve, thanks to Colt's attentive care and the natural healing properties of the herbs he found growing near the stream. They spent their days exploring the canyon, sharing stories, rediscovering each other, their bond strengthening with each passing moment. But the outside world, with its dangers and uncertainties, still loomed large. They knew that Henderson wouldn't give up, that he would be searching for them, that their time in the canyon was limited. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, Colt spoke, his voice serious, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. "We need to get that ledger to Judge Thompson," he said. "He's the only one in this territory who can stand up to Henderson, the only one who can ensure a fair trial." Judge Thompson was a legend in the Arizona Territory, a man known for his integrity, his impartiality, his unwavering commitment to justice. He was a man of principle, a man who couldn't be bought or intimidated, a man who would uphold the law, no matter the consequences. Maggie nodded, her gaze meeting his. "I know," she said. "But how? Henderson's men are everywhere. They'll be watching the roads, the trails, the towns. It'll be almost impossible to get to him." Colt thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "There's a way," he said finally, his voice low, his gaze meeting hers. "A dangerous way, but it might be our only chance." He explained his plan, a daring, risky scheme that involved using a network of old smuggling routes, trails known only to a few, trails that wound through the most treacherous and desolate parts of the territory. It was a long shot, a gamble, but it was their best hope of reaching Judge Thompson without being caught by Henderson's men. Maggie listened intently, her mind racing, assessing the risks, weighing the options. It was a dangerous plan, a plan that could easily go wrong, a plan that could cost them their lives. But she also knew that it was their only chance, their only hope of proving Colt's innocence, of bringing Henderson to justice, of securing their future. "All right," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "Let's do it." Colt smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "I knew I could count on you, Maggie," he said. They spent the next day preparing for their journey, gathering supplies, packing their horses, making sure they were ready for the challenges that lay ahead. Maggie's shoulder was still sore, but she ignored the pain, focusing on the task at hand, on the importance of their mission, on the need to stay strong, to stay focused, to stay alive. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Maggie felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss. This hidden oasis had been their sanctuary, their refuge, a place where they had rediscovered their love, their connection, their bond. It was a place where they had healed, not just their physical wounds, but the deeper scars of the past. They mounted their horses, Colt leading the way, Maggie following close behind. They rode out of the canyon, back into the harsh, unforgiving landscape, the sun beating down on them, the wind whipping around them, the dangers of the outside world once again closing in. As they rode, Maggie's thoughts turned to the concept of honor, of duty, of the choices they had made, the paths they had chosen. She was a sheriff, sworn to uphold the law, yet she was now aiding a wanted man, helping him escape, breaking the very laws she had vowed to enforce. She had wrestled with her conscience, with her sense of duty, with her loyalty to the badge she wore. But she had also come to realize that the law wasn't always just, that it could be bent and twisted to serve the powerful, that true honor lay not in blind obedience to the law, but in fighting for what was right, in protecting the innocent, in standing up for justice, even if it meant breaking the rules. Her honor collided with Colt's, a man who had lived outside the law, a man who had made mistakes, a man who had a reputation for being an outlaw. But she had also seen his good side, his sense of justice, his loyalty to his friends, his love for her. She had seen the man beneath the reputation, the man who was trying to redeem himself, the man who was worthy of a second chance. Their journey was not just about escaping Henderson, about proving Colt's innocence, about reaching Judge Thompson. It was about a collision of honor, a testing of their values, a reckoning of their past, a forging of their future. It was a journey that would challenge them, test them, and ultimately define them. And as they rode on, towards an uncertain destination, they knew that they were in it together, their fates intertwined, their hearts bound by a love that had survived the test of time, the trials of life, and the weight of their colliding worlds. Chapter 13. The Unforgiving Land. The smuggling routes were as treacherous as Colt had warned. Narrow, winding trails snaked through steep canyons, across vast, desolate plains, and over rugged mountains. The terrain was unforgiving, the weather harsh, the dangers ever-present. They rode for days, pushing themselves and their horses to the limit, their bodies aching, their minds weary, their spirits tested. They encountered rattlesnakes, scorpions, and other desert creatures, their presence a constant reminder of the wildness of this land, of the dangers that lurked around every corner. They endured scorching heat, freezing nights, and sudden, violent storms, the elements testing their resilience, their determination, their will to survive. They had to be constantly vigilant, watching for any sign of Henderson's men, for any indication that they were being followed. They avoided towns and settlements, sticking to the remote, less traveled paths, relying on Colt's knowledge of the land, his instincts, his ability to navigate by the stars. They shared what little food and water they had, rationing their supplies carefully, knowing that they might not find more for days. They slept under the stars, wrapped in their bedrolls, the vast, open sky their only blanket, the silence broken only by the howls of coyotes and the rustling of the wind. Despite the hardships, the dangers, the uncertainties, they found moments of peace, of beauty, of connection. They watched the sun rise and set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple. They marveled at the vastness of the landscape, the towering mountains, the sprawling valleys, the endless horizons. They shared stories, memories, dreams, their bond deepening with each passing day. Maggie's shoulder continued to heal, the pain slowly subsiding, her strength returning. She was grateful for Colt's care, his attentiveness, his unwavering support. He was always there for her, helping her with her horse, tending to her needs, making sure she was comfortable, safe, and protected. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces, Maggie spoke, her voice soft, her gaze meeting Colt's. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For taking care of me, for believing in me, for giving me a second chance." Colt smiled, a gentle, tender smile that reached his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Maggie," he said. "I'd do anything for you. You know that." His words, his sincerity, his unwavering love, touched her deeply. She reached out, her hand covering his, their fingers intertwining, a silent connection that spoke volumes. "I love you, Colt," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her heart overflowing with emotion. "I never stopped loving you." He leaned in, his lips meeting hers, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their bond, their love, their commitment to each other. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of understanding, of a shared past and a hopeful future. The unforgiving land, with its challenges and dangers, had brought them closer together, had tested their love, their resilience, their determination. It had stripped away the masks they had worn, the defenses they had built, the walls that had separated them. It had forced them to confront their past, to face their fears, to embrace their love. They knew that their journey was far from over, that they still had a long way to go, that the dangers were still real. But they also knew that they could face anything as long as they had each other. They were a team bound by love, by loyalty, by a shared purpose. And as they continued their trek through the unforgiving land, they held on to that love, that hope, that belief in each other, knowing that it was the only thing that would get them through, the only thing that would lead them to their destination, to their freedom, to their future. They had weathered the external elements, but it was the internal weathering that made them stronger. The land reflected their journey, and the journey had only just begun. Chapter 14. A Flame in the Darkness. The days blurred into a rhythm of writing, resting, and evading. The landscape, though harsh, held a stark beauty that Maggie found herself appreciating in stolen moments. The vast, star-studded nights, in particular, offered a sense of peace, a connection to something larger than themselves, larger than their troubles. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of navigating a treacherous mountain pass, they found a small, sheltered alcove, a natural cave carved into the rock face. It offered protection from the wind and a degree of concealment, a welcome respite from the constant exposure. They built a small fire, the flames flickering against the cave walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to animate the ancient stone. They shared their meager rations, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional sigh of the wind. Maggie's shoulder was still stiff and sore, but it was healing well. She had regained most of her strength, her determination unwavering. She was grateful for Colt's constant care, his unwavering support, his presence a source of comfort and strength. As they sat by the fire, Colt reached into his coat, pulling out the leather-bound ledger, the object that had set them on this perilous journey, the key to his freedom, the proof of Henderson's corruption. He opened it, the pages filled with his father's meticulous handwriting, a record of Henderson's illegal dealings, his bribes, his payoffs, his crimes. It was a damning indictment, a testament to Henderson's greed and ruthlessness. "This is it," Colt said, his voice low, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and apprehension. "This is what will bring him down." Maggie looked at the ledger, her heart filled with a mix of hope and fear. It was a powerful weapon, a tool for justice, but it was also a dangerous object, something that Henderson would kill to protect. "We're close, Maggie," Colt said, his gaze meeting hers. "We're close to Judge Thompson's jurisdiction. Just a few more days, and we'll be safe." Maggie nodded, her heart filled with a sense of anticipation, a glimmer of hope. But she also knew that the final leg of their journey would be the most dangerous, the most challenging. Henderson would be desperate, his men relentless, their pursuit unwavering. As they sat there, in the flickering firelight, a sudden noise broke the silence, the distant sound of horses approaching, the faint murmur of voices. Maggie's blood ran cold. They had been found. Colt quickly extinguished the fire, plunging the cave into darkness. He grabbed his rifle, his senses on high alert, his body tense and ready. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the entrance to the cave. "I'll check it out." He moved silently towards the entrance, his silhouette a dark shadow against the faint starlight. Maggie watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand gripping her own gun, her senses on high alert. She waited, her breath held, her body tense, the silence broken only by the pounding of her own heart. The sounds of the approaching riders grew louder, closer, the voices more distinct. Suddenly, a voice rang out, a familiar voice, a voice that sent a wave of relief washing over Maggie. "Colt? Maggie? It's me, Jed." Jed. Her deputy, her friend, her loyal companion. He had found them. But how? And why? Colt lowered his rifle, his body relaxing slightly. He stepped out of the cave, his voice cautious. "Jed? What are you doing here?" Jed rode into the clearing, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He dismounted, his gaze meeting Maggie's. "Maggie, thank God you're all right," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I've been searching for you for days. Henderson's been spreading lies, saying you've gone rogue, that you're helping Colt escape." Maggie's heart sank. Henderson had anticipated their move, had turned the tables on them, had made her out to be the criminal, the outlaw. "It's not true, Jed," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "Colt's innocent. He's been framed. We have proof, a ledger that details all of Henderson's illegal dealings." Jed looked from Maggie to Colt, his expression conflicted, his mind struggling to reconcile the conflicting narratives. He had known Maggie for years, had trusted her implicitly, had believed in her integrity, her commitment to the law. But he had also heard Henderson's accusations, had seen the wanted posters, had been ordered to bring them in, dead or alive. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Maggie," he said, his voice troubled, his eyes searching hers. "I need to see the ledger. I need to see the proof." Colt stepped forward, holding out the ledger.
"Here," he said.
"See for yourself." Jed took the ledger, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He read for a long time, the silence broken only by the rustling of the pages and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, he closed the ledger, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a newfound understanding. "I believe you," he said, his voice firm, his gaze meeting Maggie's. "I believe you both. Henderson's a liar, a cheat, a criminal. And I'll help you bring him down." A flame in the darkness, Jed's loyalty, his trust, his willingness to stand up for what was right, ignited a spark of hope, a renewed sense of determination. They were no longer alone. They had an ally, a friend, a companion in their fight for justice. And as they stood there, in the darkness, beneath the vast, star-studded sky, they knew that the tide was turning, that the truth would prevail, that their journey was far from over, but that they were one step closer to their goal, to their freedom, to their future. Chapter 15. Crossroads of Fate. Jed's arrival shifted the dynamics, transforming their desperate flight into a strategic alliance. The weight of their burden, while not lessened, was now shared, bolstering their spirits and renewing their resolve. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, poring over the ledger, discussing their plan, and preparing for the final confrontation. Jed's knowledge of the local terrain and the movements of Henderson's men proved invaluable. He suggested a new route, a less traveled path that would take them directly to Judge Thompson's ranch, a place known for its security and its unwavering commitment to justice. "It's a risk," Jed admitted, his voice serious, his eyes scanning the faces of Maggie and Colt. "Henderson will be expecting us to head for the main roads, the towns. He'll have patrols everywhere. This route is more dangerous, more unpredictable, but it might be our only chance of reaching the judge undetected." Colt nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll take the risk," he said. "We have to. We're too close to turn back now." Maggie agreed, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with the possibilities, the dangers, the potential for success. She trusted Jed, trusted his judgment, trusted his loyalty. She also trusted Colt, trusted his instincts, trusted his love. They set out at dawn, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in hues of orange and gold, a symbol of hope, of a new beginning, of a chance for justice. They rode in silence, their senses alert, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, their bodies tense and ready for anything. The new route was indeed more challenging, more treacherous than the previous one. They navigated narrow canyons, crossed rushing rivers, and climbed steep mountains, their horses struggling, their bodies aching, their spirits tested. But they pushed on, driven by a shared purpose, a shared determination, a shared love. As they rode, Maggie couldn't help but reflect on the choices they had made, the paths they had taken, the crossroads they had faced. She had been a sheriff, sworn to uphold the law, yet she had broken that law, had aided a wanted man, had become an outlaw herself. But she had also come to realize that true justice was not always found in the letter of the law, that it was often found in the spirit of the law, in the fight for what was right, in the protection of the innocent, in the pursuit of truth. She had chosen to follow her heart, to trust her instincts, to believe in Colt, to fight for their future. And she knew that she had made the right choice, that she would do it all again, no matter the consequences. They reached a crossroads, a literal and figurative intersection of their paths. A narrow, winding trail branched off from the main route, leading towards Judge Thompson's ranch. It was a moment of truth, a moment of decision, a moment that would determine their fate. "This is it," Jed said, his voice low, his gaze meeting Maggie's. "This is where we part ways. I'll head back to town, try to draw Henderson's attention away from you. It'll buy you some time, give you a better chance of reaching the judge. Maggie's heart ached at the thought of separating from Jed, of losing his support, his friendship, his protection. But she knew that it was the right thing to do, the only way to increase their chances of success. "Thank you, Jed," she said, her voice filled with emotion, her eyes welling up with tears. "For everything. For believing in us, for helping us, for risking your life for us." Jed smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me, Maggie," he said. "I'm just doing what's right. And I know you'll do the same." He reached out, his hand clasping hers, a silent farewell, a promise of continued support, a bond of friendship that would never be broken. They watched him ride away, his figure disappearing into the distance, a lone rider against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Maggie felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss, but she also felt a surge of determination, a renewed sense of purpose. She turned to Colt, her gaze meeting his, her eyes filled with love, with trust, with unwavering belief in him. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm, her hand reaching for his. They rode on, together, towards their destination, towards their future, towards the crossroads of fate that awaited them. They were alone again, just the two of them, against the world, but they were stronger than ever, their love a shield, their determination a weapon, their hope a guiding light. The crossroads held more than one path, and they had chosen theirs with unwavering eyes. Chapter 16. The Weight of Loyalty. The ride to Judge Thompson's ranch was fraught with tension. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, every shadow that danced in their peripheral vision sent jolts of adrenaline through Maggie. She knew Henderson's men could be anywhere, that they were constantly being hunted, that one wrong move could mean the difference between freedom and capture, life and death. Colt rode beside her, his senses on high alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his gun. He was a pillar of strength, a source of unwavering support, his presence a constant reassurance in the face of overwhelming danger. They communicated in hushed tones, sharing observations, strategizing, and offering each other words of encouragement. The unspoken bond between them, forged in the crucible of shared adversity, was stronger than ever. They were two souls intertwined, their fates inextricably linked, their love a beacon in the encroaching darkness. As they neared the ranch, the landscape began to change. Rolling hills gave way to sprawling fields, dotted with grazing cattle and sturdy fences. The air smelled of fresh hay and fertile earth, a stark contrast to the arid, unforgiving terrain they had traversed for days. They spotted the ranch house in the distance, a large, imposing structure surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. It was a symbol of stability, of justice, of hope, a beacon of light in the vast, uncertain landscape. But as they drew closer, Maggie's sense of unease grew. Something felt wrong. The ranch seemed too quiet, too still. There were no signs of activity, no ranch hands working in the fields, no cattle moving in the corrals, no smoke rising from the chimney. "Something's not right," she whispered to Colt, her voice barely audible above the gentle breeze. "It's too quiet." Colt nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "I know," he said. "Stay close. Be ready for anything." They approached the ranch cautiously, their horses walking slowly, their senses on high alert. They dismounted a short distance from the main house, tying their horses to a hitching post, their movements deliberate and silent. Colt drew his gun, his eyes scanning the windows and doors of the house. Maggie followed suit, her own gun in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. They moved towards the house, staying low to the ground, using the cover of the outbuildings to conceal their movements. As they neared the front porch, they heard a muffled sound, a groan of pain, coming from inside the house. Colt signaled for Maggie to stay put, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. He moved silently towards the front door, his gun raised, his body tense and ready. He kicked the door open, bursting into the house, his gun sweeping the room, his eyes searching for any sign of danger. Maggie followed close behind, her own gun drawn, her heart pounding in her chest. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos and violence. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered, and bloodstains marred the wooden floor. Judge Thompson lay slumped in a chair, his face pale, his body bruised and battered, his breathing shallow and ragged.
"Judge!"
Maggie cried, rushing to his side, her voice filled with alarm. She knelt beside him, gently examining his wounds, her hands trembling. He was alive, but barely. He had been severely beaten, tortured, left for dead. Colt scanned the room, his eyes narrowed, his jaw tight. "Henderson," he said, his voice filled with anger and disgust. "He was here. He must have known we were coming." Maggie's heart sank. They had been betrayed. Someone had told Henderson about their plan, had warned him of their approach. But who?
And why?
The weight of loyalty, of trust, of betrayal, pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She had trusted Jed, had believed in his loyalty, had confided in him. Could he have been the one who betrayed them? The thought was unbearable, a stab in the heart, a shattering of her faith in human nature. But she couldn't ignore the possibility, the nagging doubt that gnawed at her soul. Judge Thompson stirred, groaning in pain, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Maggie, his gaze weak and unfocused. "Maggie?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Colt?" "We're here, Judge," Maggie said, her voice soothing, her hand gently stroking his forehead. "We're here to help you." "The ledger," he gasped, his voice strained, his eyes filled with urgency. "Did you bring the ledger?" Colt stepped forward, holding out the leather-bound book. "We have it, Judge," he said. "It's safe." A flicker of relief crossed the judge's face, his body relaxing slightly. "Good," he whispered. "Good, you must get it to the authorities in Santa Fe. We will, Judge," Maggie said, her voice firm, her determination unwavering. "We promise you we will." But as she looked at the judge, at his battered body, at his fading life force, she knew that their task had just become even more difficult, more dangerous, more urgent. They had lost their sanctuary, their protector, their hope for a swift and just resolution. They were on their own again, hunted, betrayed, with a wounded man to protect and a powerful enemy to defeat. The weight of loyalty, of responsibility, of the fight for justice, pressed down on them, heavy and unforgiving. But they would not give up. They would not surrender. They would fight on, for the judge, for themselves, for the truth. Chapter 17. Broken Bonds and New Beginnings. The judge's words Santa Fe hung in the air, a daunting new objective, a distant, perilous destination. Maggie and Colt exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the immense challenge that lay ahead. They were hundreds of miles from Santa Fe, with Henderson and his men undoubtedly closing in, and a wounded man in their care. They worked quickly, tending to the judge's wounds as best they could, using strips of cloth torn from their shirts to bandage his injuries. They managed to get some water down his throat, a small victory in the face of overwhelming adversity. "We need to move him," Colt said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room. "This place isn't safe. Henderson could be back any minute." Maggie nodded, her mind racing, trying to formulate a plan. "There's an old line shack," she said, "about a mile from here, hidden in the trees. We can take him there, make him comfortable, figure out our next move." They carefully lifted the judge, his body limp and fragile, his breathing shallow and ragged. They carried him out of the house, their movements slow and deliberate, their senses on high alert. They reached the line shack, a small, dilapidated structure that had once been used by cowboys during cattle drives. It was dusty and cobweb-filled, but it offered some protection from the elements, a temporary refuge from the dangers that lurked outside. They laid the judge down on a pile of old blankets, his face pale, his body trembling. Maggie sat beside him, holding his hand, her heart aching with sorrow and anger. Colt stood by the door, his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. He was a sentinel, a protector, a warrior standing guard against the encroaching darkness. "We need to talk about Jed," Maggie said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the judge. Colt turned to face her, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I know," he said. "He's the only one who knew our plan. He's the only one who could have betrayed us." Maggie's heart twisted with pain. She had trusted Jed, had believed in his loyalty, had considered him a friend. The thought that he had betrayed them, that he had sided with Henderson, was almost unbearable. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes welling up with tears. "Why would he do this?" Colt sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know, Maggie," he said. "Maybe Henderson offered him money, power, something he couldn't refuse. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he was never really on our side." The last possibility stung the most, a deep, insidious wound that threatened to shatter Maggie's faith in human nature. She had always believed in the good in people, in the power of loyalty, in the strength of friendship. But Jed's betrayal had shaken her to her core, had forced her to confront the dark side of humanity, the capacity for deceit, for greed, for treachery. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the judge's labored breathing and the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. The weight of their situation, the burden of their loss, the uncertainty of their future, pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating. But amidst the darkness, a flicker of hope remained, a spark of resilience, a determination to fight on, to seek justice, to honor the judge's dying wish. "We can't give up," Maggie said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting Colt's. "We have to get to Santa Fe. We have to deliver the ledger. We have to expose Henderson." Colt nodded, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of purpose, a fierce determination that mirrored her own. "We will," he said. "We'll find a way. We always do." They spent the rest of the day caring for the judge, planning their escape, and preparing for the long and perilous journey to Santa Fe. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, that they were facing overwhelming opposition, that their chances of success were slim. But they also knew that they had something worth fighting for, something worth risking everything for: the truth, justice, and the love that had blossomed between them, a love that had survived betrayal, hardship, and the constant threat of death. It was a love that gave them strength, courage, and the unwavering belief that they could overcome any obstacle, conquer any foe, and ultimately triumph over adversity. It was time to leave behind broken bonds and forge new beginnings. Chapter 18. A Storm of Truth. They left the line shack under the cover of darkness, their movements silent and cautious. The judge, weak but stable, was carefully secured to a makeshift travois, fashioned from branches and blankets, pulled by Maggie's horse. Colt rode alongside, his rifle at the ready, his senses on high alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The journey to Santa Fe was arduous and fraught with peril. They avoided the main roads, sticking to the back trails, the hidden paths, the treacherous terrain. They traveled mostly at night, resting during the day in concealed locations, always wary of Henderson's men, always anticipating an ambush. The weather turned against them, a fierce storm brewing in the distance, the sky darkening, the wind picking up, the air heavy with the threat of rain. They pressed on, knowing that they needed to find shelter, that they couldn't expose the judge to the elements. As the storm broke, the wind howled, the rain lashed down, and the lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, blinding flashes. They struggled against the elements, their horses slipping and sliding on the muddy trails, their bodies soaked to the bone, their spirits tested. They found a small cave, a shallow recess in a rock face, offering some protection from the wind and rain. They huddled together, sharing their body heat, trying to stay warm, trying to keep the judge dry and comfortable. The storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within Maggie's heart. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The betrayal by Jed, the near death of the judge, the constant threat of capture, the overwhelming odds against them, it all weighed heavily on her, threatening to crush her spirit. She looked at Colt, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a small, makeshift lamp. He was watching over the judge, his expression filled with concern, with determination, with unwavering love. He was her rock, her anchor, her strength in the face of adversity. "We'll make it, Maggie," he said, his voice low, his gaze meeting hers. "I promise you we'll make it." His words, his confidence, his unwavering belief in them, gave her a surge of strength, a renewed sense of hope. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, drawing comfort from his presence, from his warmth, from his love. As the storm raged, a sudden realization struck Maggie, a piece of the puzzle that had been eluding her, a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. "Jed," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with understanding. "He didn't betray us. He couldn't have." Colt looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked. "He knew our plan," Maggie explained, her voice gaining strength, her mind racing. "He knew we were going to Judge Thompson's ranch. But he also knew that Henderson would be watching the roads, the trails, the towns. He deliberately led us to the ranch, knowing that Henderson would be there, knowing that it was a trap." Colt's eyes widened, his understanding mirroring her own. "He was trying to protect us," he said. "He knew that if we went straight to Santa Fe, we'd be caught. He led us to the ranch, hoping that we would be able to escape, hoping that we would find another way." It all made sense now. Jed's conflicted behavior, his hesitant words, his decision to part ways with them at the crossroads. He had been playing a dangerous game, a double agent, trying to protect them while appearing to be loyal to Henderson. The weight of guilt, of suspicion, of betrayal, lifted from Maggie's heart, replaced by a surge of relief, of gratitude, of renewed faith in her friend. She had misjudged Jed, had doubted his loyalty, had allowed her fear and anger to cloud her judgment. "We need to find him," she said, her voice firm, her determination unwavering. "We need to tell him we know the truth. We need his help." Colt nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "We will," he said. "But first, we need to get the judge to safety. We need to get to Santa Fe." The storm eventually subsided, the rain slowing to a drizzle, the wind dying down, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moon. They emerged from the cave, their bodies stiff and sore, their clothes soaked, but their spirits renewed. They continued their journey, their resolve strengthened by the revelation about Jed, their determination fueled by the knowledge that they were not alone, that they had an ally, a friend, fighting for them from within the enemy's ranks. The storm of truth had cleared the air, had washed away the doubts and suspicions, had revealed the true nature of their bonds, their loyalties, their friendships. And as they rode on, towards Santa Fe, towards their ultimate goal, they knew that they were closer than ever to achieving justice, to exposing Henderson, to securing their freedom, to building a new life together. The storm was over, but a different kind of storm was brewing, one they would face with renewed strength. Chapter 19. The Reckoning Dawn. The final leg of their journey to Santa Fe was a blur of exhaustion, determination, and unwavering focus. They pushed themselves and their horses to the limit, driven by the urgency of their mission, by the need to get the judge to safety, by the desire to bring Henderson to justice. They arrived in Santa Fe under the cover of darkness, the city a sprawling maze of adobe buildings, narrow streets, and hidden courtyards. They moved cautiously, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the back alleys, the shadows, their senses on high alert. Colt had a contact in Santa Fe, a former associate who had turned his life around and now worked as a stable hand. They found him at a small, unassuming stable on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could blend in, a place where they could rest and regroup. The stable hand, a grizzled old man named Silas, greeted them with surprise and concern. He listened to their story, his eyes widening with each revelation, his understanding growing with each passing moment. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm, his gaze meeting Colt's. "I owe you that much, and I believe in what you're doing." He provided them with food, water, and fresh horses. He also gave them a safe place to hide the judge, a small, hidden room above the stable, where he could rest and recover. With the judge secure, Maggie and Colt turned their attention to their next objective, delivering the ledger to the authorities and exposing Henderson's crimes. Silas informed them that the federal marshal's office was located in the heart of the city, near the plaza, a heavily guarded building that would be difficult to approach undetected. Henderson will be watching, Silas warned, his voice serious, his eyes filled with concern. He knows you're in Santa Fe. He'll have his men everywhere. He'll be desperate to stop you. Maggie and Colt exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the immense challenge that lay ahead. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a powerful, ruthless enemy. But they were also determined, resilient, and fueled by a burning desire for justice. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. They devised a plan, a daring, risky scheme that involved using stealth, deception, and a bit of luck to reach the marshal's office and deliver the ledger. It was a long shot, a gamble, but it was their only chance. As they prepared to leave the stable, Maggie turned to Colt, her gaze meeting his, her eyes filled with love, with trust, with unwavering belief in him. "Be careful," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. He smiled, a gentle, tender smile that reached his eyes. "I will," he said. "And you too. We'll do this together. We always do." They set out into the night, their movements silent and cautious, their senses on high alert. They navigated the labyrinthine streets of Santa Fe, staying in the shadows, avoiding the patrols, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached the plaza, the heart of the city, a large, open space surrounded by imposing buildings, including the federal marshal's office. The plaza was bustling with activity. Even at this late hour, people coming and going, vendors hawking their wares, music playing in the distance. They blended in with the crowd, their faces hidden, their movements inconspicuous. They moved slowly, deliberately, towards the marshal's office, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, their hands never far from their guns. As they neared the entrance to the office, they spotted a group of men standing guard, their faces grim, their eyes watchful, their rifles at the ready. They were Henderson's men, Maggie realized, her heart sinking. He had anticipated their move, had set a trap for them, but it was too late to turn back. They had come too far, risked too much. To give up now, they had to press on, had to find a way to get past the guards, had to deliver the ledger. A reckoning dawn was breaking, not just over the city of Santa Fe, but over their lives, their past, their future. It was a dawn of truth, of justice, of reckoning, a dawn that would determine their fate, their freedom, their love. And as they prepared to face their final challenge, they knew that they were ready, that they were together, that they would fight until the very end. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that hung in the air. Maggie and Colt exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke volumes. They knew this was at the final confrontation, the culmination of their long and perilous journey, the moment of truth. They moved with a practiced ease, a seamless coordination born of shared danger and unwavering trust. Colt, ever the strategist, took the lead, his eyes scanning the guards, assessing their positions, calculating their next move. "We need a distraction," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the bustling sounds of the plaza. "Something to draw their attention away from the entrance." Maggie nodded, her mind racing, her eyes searching for an opportunity. She spotted a group of street musicians playing a lively tune near the fountain in the center of the plaza. An idea sparked in her mind, a daring, risky plan that just might work. "I have an idea," she said, her voice low, her gaze meeting Colt's. "Follow my lead." She moved towards the musicians, her steps purposeful, her demeanor confident. She approached them, a smile playing on her lips, a request in her eyes. "Could you play something a little louder?" she asked, her voice charming, her eyes twinkling. "Something with a bit more energy?" The musicians, eager to please, readily agreed. They launched into a raucous, up-tempo tune, the music filling the plaza, drawing the attention of the crowd, including the guards at the marshal's office. As the music swelled, Maggie moved towards the entrance, her movements fluid and graceful, her eyes fixed on her target. Colt followed close behind, his hand hovering near his gun, his senses on high alert. The guards, distracted by the music, momentarily shifted their attention away from the entrance. It was the opening they needed, the brief window of opportunity they had been waiting for. Maggie and Colt slipped past the guards, their movements quick and silent, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were inside the marshal's office, the final hurdle cleared, the goal within reach. But their victory was short-lived. As they moved towards the main desk, a figure emerged from a back room, a tall, imposing man with a cruel face and a cold, calculating gaze. It was Henderson. He stood there, blocking their path, his eyes filled with hatred, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. Well, he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Look what the cat dragged in. The sheriff and her outlaw lover. I've been expecting you. Maggie and Colt stood their ground, their faces grim, their bodies tense and ready. The final confrontation had begun. It's over, Henderson, Maggie said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. We have proof of your crimes. We have the ledger. Henderson laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the office. You have nothing, he said. That ledger is worthless. And you two are dead. He drew his gun, his movements swift and deadly. But Colt was faster. He drew his own gun, firing a shot that struck Henderson's arm, sending his weapon flying. Henderson cried out in pain, clutching his wounded arm, his face contorted with rage. But he wasn't finished. He lunged at Colt, tackling him to the ground, the two men grappling for control. Maggie raised her gun, her finger on the trigger, but she hesitated. She couldn't risk hitting Colt. She had to find another way. She spotted a heavy inkwell on the desk, a solid, brass object that could serve as a weapon. She grabbed it, rushing towards the struggling men, her heart pounding in her chest. She brought the inkwell down on Henderson's head, a forceful blow that stunned him, knocking him unconscious. He slumped to the floor, his body limp, his reign of terror finally over. Colt got to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his clothes torn, his face bruised. He looked at Maggie, his eyes filled with gratitude, with admiration, with love. You saved me, he said, his voice hoarse. We saved each other, she replied, her voice trembling, her body shaking with adrenaline. The marshal, alerted by the commotion, rushed into the office, his deputies following close behind. They took in the scene, their eyes widening with surprise and disbelief. Maggie handed the marshal the ledger, her hand steady, her gaze unwavering. This is proof of Henderson's crimes, she said. He's been terrorizing this territory for years. He needs to be brought to justice. The marshal took the ledger, his expression grim, his eyes filled with determination. He will be, he said. I promise you he will. The final confrontation was over. The truth had prevailed. Justice would be served. And as Maggie and Colt stood there, in the aftermath of the battle, they knew that they had won, not just against Henderson, but against the demons of their past, against the obstacles that had stood in their way, against the forces that had tried to tear them apart. Their hearts and horizons had collided, merged, and formed a new landscape, a landscape of love, of trust, of freedom, of a future they could finally embrace, together. Epilogue. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Henderson's arrest and subsequent trial made headlines across the territory. The ledger, with its meticulous record of his crimes, provided irrefutable evidence, leading to his swift conviction and imprisonment. The people of Redemption and the wider territory rejoiced, celebrating the end of his reign of terror and the dawn of a new era of justice. Maggie was hailed as a hero, her bravery, her determination, her unwavering commitment to the law lauded by all. She was offered her old job back as sheriff, but she politely declined. Her experiences had changed her, had broadened her perspective, had shown her that there were other ways to serve justice, other ways to make a difference. Jed, cleared of all suspicion, was reinstated as her deputy, his loyalty and integrity vindicated. He apologized to Maggie and Colt, his voice filled with remorse, his eyes expressing his deep regret for the misunderstanding. They forgave him, understanding the impossible situation he had been in, the pressure he had been under, the difficult choices he had been forced to make. Colt, his name cleared, his past forgiven, was finally free. He had faced his demons, had paid his dues, had emerged a changed man. He was no longer an outlaw, no longer a fugitive, but a man of honor, a man of integrity, a man worthy of Maggie's love. They returned to redemption, not as sheriff and outlaw, but as partners, as equals, as lovers. They settled on the Boone Ranch, Maggie's childhood home, a place filled with memories, with love, with the promise of a new beginning. They worked side by side, rebuilding the ranch, restoring it to its former glory, creating a haven of peace, of prosperity, of happiness. They raised horses, cattle, and a family, their children growing up strong and free, surrounded by the love of their parents and the beauty of the vast, open landscape. Maggie and Colt often rode together, exploring the canyons, the mesas, the valleys that had been the backdrop to their tumultuous journey. They remembered the hardships, the dangers, the challenges they had faced, but they also remembered the love that had sustained them, the bond that had strengthened them, the hope that had guided them. They revisited the hidden canyon, their sanctuary, their refuge, the place where they had rediscovered their love, their connection, their commitment to each other. They stood by the stream, their hands clasped, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had endured the test of time. Years passed, their hair turned silver, their faces lined with the wisdom of age, their bodies bearing the marks of a life well lived. But their love remained, strong and unwavering, a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of forgiveness, of redemption, of second chances. And as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple, they knew that their journey had been worth it, that every challenge, every obstacle, every heartbreak had led them to this moment, to this peace, to this love, to this forever. The final confrontation had not been an ending, but a merging of two souls ready to start again. The dawn was not just a time of day, but a promise that kept renewing, like their love. The end.